everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Ben Burgess and Stefan Bertram. And for possibly, I think, the second time ever, we have a guest, Matt
Hey.
McManus, who's here to tell us about his book, or possibly Ben is here to tell us about his thoughts on Matt's book, and probably both.
Yes, I think that's right. That last one. Yeah, I want to say it's the third time, but there was Tibor, and I don't remember.
I don't remember anyone other than Tibor.
That might have just been Tibor. Yeah.
I mean, we had plans to invite Finkelstein, but as I said previously, I think he was expecting the Gaza genocide to end at some point.
Sure. Yeah. There's his time.
I mean, you think at some point they just run out of people, but apparently not.
Yeah.
No, I mean they're really imitating the Russians in that kind of making what should be an apocalyptic event seem to last for years.
Yeah, it's grim stuff.
Yeah. Very true. So yeah, so this is a bit of an odd format since usually what we do here is that Stefan asked me about the essay that I wrote for Philosophy for the People for this week, and this week I just got back from 9 days in the UK.
Was it 9 days in England or 9 days in London? Actually, did you leave?
I did leave. I actually visited my sister and her family for a couple of days. They live in Wales, but yeah. So in between the two 9 days, so and it was like 3 talks in 9 days, and I'm obviously very jet lagged still now. So I was
at least 2 of them were on this topic, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So there was one at King's College, the thing Alfie Brown set up that was about Marx and AI. But the other 2 were with Matt, and they were in one way or another about this topic. And so after all that, I clearly was not going to get it together to write something brand new for the Substack for this week. This, which was my presentation at a panel about Matt's book at Historical Materialism in London, was just about perfect length for a Substack essay, and I thought translated to that. So we just put it out as that. And yeah, I'm talking to the screen, so Ash needs to be here for that. That's how that works. So yeah, I think that what would maybe be most useful here is if before I talk about what I actually say in the essay, which is a response to a specific part of the book, we kind of, that would kind of be bringing us in 2/3 of the way through the movie. Maybe instead, Matt could start us off by talking about the book in general, right? Like I think that the title, for the cross stream to GTA, I used a different title, but the title you used for the stream for TIR was Liberal Socialism? ? Exclamation point, ? Right? And which I think is a lot of people's reaction to that combination of words, right? Does not compute, right? So maybe before I talk about what I say about part of the book, maybe Matt's better off kind of getting the ball rolling, talking about the book in general and what the project is.
Sure, absolutely. So there are 3 main motivators for writing the book. I'll kind of go through them, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the specifics of the argument. But one of the main motivators for the book was, as probably at least a few people know, most of my time I end up writing on things like the political right, whether it's postmodern conservatism or Heidegger or Nietzsche or any of those folks. And there's a kind of really crude reactionary argument that runs that basically anyone to the left of Ronald Reagan is just a liberal socialist, communist, fascist, collectivist, all the kind of euphemisms, right? And that's not kind of what I'm aiming at here. But there's also a more intelligent strand of right-wing thought that runs from people like, say, Friedrich Nietzsche through Heidegger, that's always insisted there was a kind of deep elective affinity between liberalism and socialism in the sense of both being humanist, egalitarian, liberatory doctrines that just thought that ordinary people should have more of a say in how they're governed. And of course, the people like Nietzsche and Heidegger held that kind of ideal in contempt. So that was one of the inspirations for the book. The second inspiration for the book was really just kind of intellectual and spending a lot of time in left-wing spaces, right? Whenever you go into left spaces, and, this is kind of what Ben was gesturing to, You almost always hear people be like, "Ooh, liberalism, terrible, crap." You know what I mean? Conformist. We've got to bury the libs, or resistance libs are hypocritical in some way, shape, or form.
Own the libs.
Yeah, own the libs. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that in my book, right? It's not an apologia for normie liberalism, as Ben might call it. Actually, I'm extremely critical of neoliberalism for reasons I'll get into in a second. But when I started to really press my left-wing comrades on these things, being like, "Well, do you really think that we should do away with freedom of expression, for example? Perhaps like that canonical liberal right?" Almost everybody would be like, "Absolutely not," right? Same thing when it came to things like freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, right to a fair trial. You get the gist of it, right? If anything, their usual response was, those rights will be better protected with us than they will in the hands of normie libs. We'll very happily auction them away to the fascists if they need to protect private property. And kind of one of my goals in the book was to just make some of these moral overlaps or normative symmetries more explicit by kickstarting this dialogue. And then the last motivator for the book, which I was a little bit uncertain about, but now seems pretty clear, was my concern that unless liberalism recovered some of its revolutionary and radical energies and recognized that it needed a working class base, it would be unable to confront right-wing populism effectively. The kind of quote that I kept coming back to in the book again and again was from Samuel Moyne's book, Liberalism Against Itself, where I said, look, if liberals aren't able to offer a sense of hope to working people and everyone else who's marginalized for that reason, that we are unlikely to see our creed survive into the 21st century. And he says, unfortunately, survival itself is just not good enough. And that was written.
That's why when I was asking Matt about Trump winning last weekend, he was just doing like money signs the whole time.
That's right. Yeah, I was like, now's my moment, right? But yeah, no. Needless to say, I wasn't surprised when he ran, in no small part because if you look at the Kamala campaign and what is offering in Bidenism beforehand, it was just fundamentally uninspiring and doesn't seem to have learned any deep lessons from what happened in 2016 in the United States or around the world in a lot of places, right? So I really think that if liberalism is to have a shot at survival, it needs to kind of offer a sense of hope to working people again that hasn't for a long time. And I hope that liberal socialism can help provide a little bit of theoretical guidance on what that might end up looking like.
Yeah. As Stefan reminds us, this does feel kind of funny right now because we all saw each other in the flesh 9 days ago. But
my liver still hasn't recovered from all that, actually.
No comment. In any case, yeah. So okay. So that's the like what you were just talking about was kind of like the sort of broad strokes of like why first it's interesting to think about the kind of overlap, certainly in normative ideals, between some of the things that we've thought of historically as liberalism and some kind of socialist project, and also why that might be particularly politically important right now, right? Even before the Democrats had were generous enough to horribly fumble the election just in time for your book to come out. And
I prefer to say they had the shit kicked out of them, right? I mean, not so badly that they can't get back up and take another stab at things, but it was definitely a shit kicking.
No, it was a huge shit kicking. I mean, that's I mean, like Donald Trump won Latino men. It was a crazy shit kicking, right? Like so yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so that's like kind of the motive for the project, right? And we should say that you spend a awful lot of like what a lot of the book is you going through different philosophers, political thinkers, and sort of exploring what they had to say about this cluster of subjects, right? So there are big chapters on people like John Rawls, John Stuart Mill, and who were like big important liberal philosophers who were certainly at least socialism curious. I think in Rawls's case, right, like at the end of his life in Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, he says, well, earlier on in A Theory of Justice, he'd taken the position that, look, I'm just a abstract theorist, right? If you want to know what like actual economic arrangement, like is going to sort of best come closest to embodying this, that's kind of the job for the empirical, researcher, right? I'm just giving you the general, principles to use as the parameter. I can stay agnostic.
It's for others to write the cookbooks of the present.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But then by justice, fairness, and restatement, at the end of his career, he's like, okay, actually, on second thought, I don't think capitalism, even sort of nice social democratic welfare state capitalism, can fulfill this ideal. But the man was pretty averse to taking definite political stands, and he left. Even there, he left the door open a little bit. He gave two options, right? He says that there's property owning democracy, which what that means is a little bit tricky to think through, or what he calls liberal socialism, or roughly what we would often think of as some form of democratic socialism. And he says, well, either one of these could fulfill the requirements of the theory. And it seems like what property owning democracy must mean is somehow or another, maybe we've distributed ownership so widely that there really isn't a separate capitalist class anymore, even though we don't have like collective social ownership of the means of production.
It's total victory for the petit bourgeois.
Yeah, right. So he's at least socialism curious, and I know people make these big arguments that really the first option doesn't make that much sense. So like you're kind of left with the second option. And John Stuart Mill, this is interesting. I actually just before this, we were all spending our time the way everybody should, fighting on Twitter, and on
it's the only way to live, babe.
this came up extensively there, right? That John Stuart Mill, is calling himself some kind of socialist, by the end of by the time he's writing his.
Yeah, I was really surprised during Matt's talk at Goldsmiths when I saw a quote from John Stuart Mill where he hit the fucking "those who shall not work shall not eat."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, exactly.
And considering I think most of the people he knew didn't work.
And I should add also, in his chapters on socialism, he actually gestures towards that, where he points out that a lot of the people he associate with who are most fond of this kind of workmanship ideal and insist, hard work should be the basis of reward, are not the people who actually work hardest in society. He points out that if you wanted to look at the people who actually work hardest in society and probably do some pretty foundational things, it would be coal miners, for example, right? Or agricultural farmers. And he points out that these are the people who are often least remunerated in society for the hard work that they contribute, whereas the people who spend their days rhapsodizing about the workmanship ideal usually at least inherited a little bit of money, and that's why they have time to release newspaper op-ed after newspaper op-ed, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, this is John Stuart Mill anticipating like the the kind of thing that would come up if when I I don't know, debate somebody like Charlie Kirk, that's like in order to make anti-welfare state points, you make such a big deal saying that you're against people making a living without making contributions, but somehow inheritance is fine, stock ownership is fine. It's confusing, but okay. So that's kind of like the
my favorite example was Ben Shapiro after Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard had this long rambling declamation against affirmative action programs, which whatever you think about from a left-wing standpoint, at least symbolically gestured towards the amelioration of equality. But very shortly afterwards, he was like, well, legacy appointments, though, that's a little bit different, right? Maintain something like that because it's nice to keep on the tradition in the family, right?
Yeah. That's the which is right, because if you're trying to,
it's like affirmative action for poor black students, like that Drake meme, no, but like affirmative action for rich people, wow,
Yeah. If you're being rewarded for having a dad who went to Harvard, right, then meritocracy can go out the window. Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Okay. So that's kind of like the heart of the book. is these kind of discussions of various thinkers in their relationship to this, and mostly, I think you say, you're doing like a project of recovery, right? More than sort of argument or even defense, really, for the most part. That it's that you're trying to like uncover these like philosophically interesting links between these ideas. But maybe the chapter where you sort of go furthest in terms of making like new points, right? And about the historical thinkers, at least. And certainly the chapter that I was focusing on, the essay that we're supposed to be talking about, is the chapter on Karl Marx, right? So that this is, basically what I say in the essay is, look, to the extent that, that this is, to the extent this panel is, advertised as critics of the book confronting the author, that's perhaps a bit implausible, for two reasons, right? One is that the third panelist is actually married to you, so I really don't think she has that much credibility as a, as an anti-McManusite, right? But my conflict of interest doesn't run quite as deep as all that, but I will admit to some prior acquaintance with the defendant, and then so on an interpersonal level, that's true, but also on a philosophical level, I mean, the kind of basic point that the socialist project has deep roots in and is kind of inexplicable without some kind of baseline commitment to Enlightenment liberal values is something that I kind of thought was true already, right? And so the basic point of the book is very congenial to me. So what I said instead is basically, not really a critic, but I do have two at least friendly amendments. And the first you kind of already gestured at, which is this question of disambiguating what we mean when we talk about liberals. And so the previous talk we did, the one Stefan was at, actually, at Goldsmiths, was my contribution was kind of very focused on that point, and maybe at some point I'll adapt that to something for the Substack. I'm not sure it would fit quite as well there, but why, look, if what we mean by the liberals is the sort of 21st century political faction, I kind of think that we already have too much conciliation already, right? But I'd like more antagonism, but so that's like a kind of politics point. But then as far as the theory goes, I think that what I focused on in this case was the chapter on Marx, because I think that some of the Marx stuff I have a slightly different read of, but do you want to just kind of give people a general sense of what you have to say about Marx in the book?
Sure. Well, I have a lot of things to say about Marx in the book. Along with the Rawls chapter, it's without a doubt the most important chapter in the book. And one of the things that I point out is that there are kind of two readers that I expect will encounter a Marx chapter in a book on liberal socialism. There'll be some readers for whom Marx just is socialism, right? That's what it is. And they'll think, what's the point of all this kind of liberal stuff surrounding it? Now I finally got into like the real deal. Socialist digression. And then the second kind of reader is probably someone who honestly is just tired of hearing about Marxist socialism, thinks that's either passe or they've learned enough about it and just wants to hear about liberal socialism without a big long digression on Marxism. But I point out that I think it's extremely important for both readers to have a chapter on Marx in a book on liberal socialism, precisely because I think that there are a lot of liberal insights that Marx defends that socialists aren't always as appreciative of as they should be. And also because Marx offers some important criticisms of liberalism, including progressive liberalism, that liberal socialists in particular should be attentive to. So just to make a very long story extremely short, right? One of the things that I point out in the book, following people like Igor Shakatbrod in his revisiting Karl Marx's critique of liberalism, Shakatbrod points out that Marx from very early on was committed to defending very, very prominent liberal principles, right? That included especially freedom of the press. No surprise, since Marx was a newspaper man for much of his early life, and he got pretty tired, I imagine, after a certain point of his newspapers being constantly censored and shut down by the Prussian and various European states. He obviously defended freedom.
Marx is very much cancelled.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the things that I think is most unusual when all those kind of right wingers talk about postmodern neo-Marxist canceling everything, because I was like, the original political actor who was canceled in many ways was Karl Marx, who had to just hopscotch his way through Europe, writing his pamphlets before he inevitably got exiled and saw all of his property expropriated, ironically.
There is also something a little bit funny about like the same right wingers who want to want to like really valorize dissent against authoritarian regimes, be like, Marx is a fucking bum, he was living in poverty, having to beg his friend Engels for money. It's like, yeah, but the only reason he was living in poverty instead of having some nice German university post is that he was a dissident against an authoritarian regime.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Marx actually walked the walk rather than just, complaining very loudly to Dave Rubin about how he was being censored before cashing, a $10,000 check all the way to, and, laughing all the way to the bank. Anyway, so Marx defended, a variety of liberal rights over the course of his long career, rights to freedom of expression, right to assembly, obviously argued for universal enfranchisement and suffrage, which was, something that a position that he shared with people like John Stuart Mill. And it's pretty obvious why he would argue for these things, right? Not only did he think that they were historically necessary parts of moving towards an emancipatory society, he also recognized that they're pretty foundational to be able to organize the workers, right? Unless you actually enfranchise workers and gave them the vote, it'd be extremely hard to agitate for things like, say, the shortening of the working day, which, as anybody knows, especially post-capital, was kind of one of Marx's many different pet projects. So just from a kind of historical standpoint, it's important to recognize that Marx's specific normative commitments were considerably more liberal than people give him credit for. And in writings like the Critique of the Gotha Program, I point out that Marx is actually extremely critical of utopian socialists who project this idea of a kind of millenarian break with what he calls bourgeois society. He says, look, that's fundamentally ahistorical and anti-materialist. There's no such thing as a kind of millenarian break where you're going to have liberal or bourgeois society here, and then the next day you're going to have socialist society, and the two are going to look completely different, right? He says any new society that emerges is going to be stamped by many features of the old. And those who were at HM knows that we had a very long discussion about this whole stamping metaphor. And he says, this will include many features of bourgeois right. And he says that, this is just going to be something that people have to accept for a very long period of time before hypothetically a superabundance of resources makes any kind of right in many ways unnecessary, or at least any form of bourgeois right. And we can move on to a society that advances under the banners of the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So that's kind of the nice things that I say Marx proclaims about liberalism. In terms of the criticisms that he makes of many liberal socialists, I actually think that some of them have an awful lot of merit. And to Ben's earlier point, this is why I describe my book as a retrieval or a recovery, not necessarily a defense, because I point out pretty routinely that the tradition of liberal socialism, whether we're talking practically or a theory, mostly failed to actually achieve or instantiate its objectives. What we have now was a very virulent kind of right populism, and before that, neoliberalism. Nothing that looks even remotely like liberal socialism. And in order to inhibit something like that from happening again, liberal socialists will probably have to learn an awful lot from Marx and Marxism, that each generation just seems almost compelled to have to relearn anew. So two of the big critiques that I lob at the liberal socialist tradition that are extremely inspired by Marx is, first off, I point out that most liberal socialists like John Stuart Mill and John Rawls had a very deficient understanding of the different forms of power that permeate society. You can scour Mills's work, you can scour Rawls's work at great length, and every now and then you'll see gestures towards things like the effect of hegemony, right? Or the mute compulsion of reified economic relations on individuals and the way they compel certain kinds of behavior without people even really being fully conscious about it. But there's nothing that's anywhere nearly as sophisticated as what you'd find in the Marxist tradition. So liberal socialists would really need to draw very heavily on these very deep and often profound understandings of the permutations of power, and that would require being a lot more Marxist. The other thing that I point out that liberal socialists could learn from the Marxist tradition, and where I think that Marx would be critical of liberal socialism, is almost all the liberal socialists that I talk about in the book had very little understanding of capitalism as a global system. They occasionally would gesture to that in cases of things people like in cases like Hobhouse, for example, or Bernstein, where every now and then you get like a kind of softball criticism of imperialism or global capitalism, but nothing all that substantial. For the most part, liberal socialists kind of took the nation state for granted as the basic structure, to use the Rawlsian term, which liberal socialist justice was meant to apply to. And I point out that that is a very, very serious error, right? Especially in the 21st century. Unless you understand capitalism as a global systematic totality that is very often advanced, not so much through economic mechanisms, but through things like imperialism, you're not really going to understand what it is that we're up against. So those are just two areas where I argue that liberal socialists have an awful lot to learn from Marx. And unless they learn these kind of lessons, they're unlikely to see their creed survive and prosper.
Yeah, so that's the kind of positive element that, of course, there's going to be much more agreement about all of that. Like, really, the point, the thing where I think there is interest in disagreement is, which is largely exegetical, is about what the kind of limits of that affinity might be in Marx, right? So in the chapter, for example, you talk about some of the formulations in the Communist Manifesto about centralizing, factories, mines, farms, etc., into state ownership. And I think that some of your reading of what's going on in the manifesto is that you kind of see this sort of proto like Leninist, like vanguardist kind of position in Marx's stance there. Although you do give him credit for God, what was that 23 years later, right, in the Civil War in France, right, writing about the Paris Commune, for having like seeming to move away from that stance, which you call a couple times in the chapter, democratic centralism, towards something more actually democratic, when he's praising these kind of ultra democratic features of the Paris Commune, that all elected officials are recallable by their constituents at any time for any reason, and all that stuff. In fact, I think there's a point in there where you maybe suggest that Marx has actually bent the stick too far in the other direction, that this would be like too chaotic as a kind of long-term national political system. And you sort of say, okay, Marx is embracing more, liberal in the sense of more democratic ideas about what a post-revolutionary society could look like, but even there, you worry that he's not really tracking sort of issues that liberals might worry about with regard to the rights of unpopular minorities, or sort of the importance of the division of powers, to stop to stop too much power from being centralized in the hands of any given organ of government that could then become oppressive. So I want to just stop here and kind of do a check to see if all this is like a fair characterization of what you say in the chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's very accurate. Now, I want to be clear, right? I do not claim that Karl Marx is in any way responsible for Stalinism, right?
Sure.
Because every now and then he deployed some problematic rhetoric in the Communist Manifesto, right? I do blame the Stalinists for implementing Stalinism, being inspired by or appealing to that kind of rhetoric, right? But I do point out that there is something that is extremely problematic about this idea of a kind of vanguardist party speaking on behalf of the workers, but that is ultimately intending to emancipate the whole of society, right? I think that gives too much prerogative to any one political party, and that is potentially very dangerous, not just from a liberal standpoint, but I'd also add from a democratic socialist standpoint. So per your comment, I much prefer the kind of political theoretical schema outlined in the Civil War in France. I think that there's actually a lot that's really praiseworthy about it, particularly with regard to instantiating principles like the importance of self-governance, right? But as you mentioned, I also indicate that I have a few problems with that as well. But we can talk about those if you want.
Sure. I mean, so basically, I think that like one thing to do is just to back up here a little bit, right, and say like, something that I think we really haven't done in this discussion yet, which is like, okay, look, what do if we're talking about Marx's relationship to liberalism, right? What do we mean by liberalism? We sort of agreed earlier that we don't mean liberalism in the sense of the current of 21st century, Western politics, and that we mean something that has to do with like, propositions adhered to by guys like John Stuart Mill or Rawls. Mm-hmm. But I would say, right, if in general what those relevant propositions are, I mean, obviously we can talk about like the details of Rawlsian liberalism or Millsian liberalism or whatever, but like, view from 10,000 feet, right? Like what makes something a liberalism? I would say what we're basically talking about is two things, and I'm not necessarily exhaustive, right? But like certainly at least these two, right? Which are, one, what certainly Rawls emphasizes when he's talking about the history of liberalism, which is a belief in like sort of universalism about moral status, basically, that everybody counts the same, right? Nobody is born with different, rights or obligations than anybody else. That and two, a kind of deep suspicion of arbitrary power, right? Because you could be in fact more morally universalist than some classical liberals, right? I mean, like John Locke, for example, is like a sort of believes in universal rights, except for groups like Catholics, you obviously have to exclude. But
I wasn't wrong about that.
But yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think natives do well out of this picture either.
No,
he was wrong about that. Yeah.
No, you gotta like to even see the liberalism at all, you got a great amount of severe historical curve. But but yeah, like so if but yeah, in the look, all white Protestants, that's we're created equal. But yeah, so putting that aside, right, you could be a moral universalist but be illiberal in the sense that you kind of like are willing to put your faith in some all-powerful state institution to do whatever's best for everybody. And clearly whatever we mean by this, we mean to rule that out also, right? So maybe the sort of first plank of liberalism in this broad sense, it's sort of pretty obvious that Marx that Marx is a liberal in that sense, right? In fact, that was the essay I wrote for a previous book that Matt had put out about this, liberalism and socialism, embittered something or something. Anyway, that thing, right? That like was pretty much focused on that, right? But then like where it gets more interesting, and I think where some of these criticisms that you have come in, is about Marx's relationship to the second plank, right? And so if we're worried about like giving like about arbitrary power coming from an all-powerful state, and like now, right, not just like you could say, yeah, sure, I'm confident that a couple generations after the revolution we'll have so much material abundance that it'll just be a non-issue and the state will have withered away anyway and whatever, right? But like right now, immediately, right? 5 minutes after the revolution, we're worried about, we're worried about arbitrary power from an all-powerful state. Then there are at least two ways that you could seek to curb that, right? One is, well, instead of just being ruled over by a party that claims to have the interests of the working class at heart, you have direct mass, democratic participation, and two, some kind of constitutional safeguards on what the state could do, right? So clearly, I think, just to follow the thread of this, right, you're kind of saying, okay, you maybe have some concerns about both points given some of Marx's formulations in the Communist Manifesto. By the Civil War in France, he's at least clearly coming out on a good, he's clearly saying good things about number one. In fact, maybe you even think he's like going implausibly far in that direction. But you still have concerns about Planck too, right? And
I was going to say before Matt replies that I think one of the confusions here between people who say, like, in the discussion of does Marx and Marxists want to abolish liberal rights, is that there's a very clear sense in which this is true, but it's the distant sense that Ben just mentioned, that Marx wants to abolish liberal rights in the sense that liberal rights exist within this relationship between a private individual, a state, and kind of a to-be-feared mass. And this is both not how rights worked before capitalism and modernism and liberalism and the state and so on, and will presumably not how they work in communism. And so in that sense, Marx wants to abolish freedom of speech or whatever, but he doesn't want to abolish freedom of speech in the sense of, like, people should be free to say things. He just wants to abolish the conditions by which we need a state and so on and so forth to enforce these kinds of freedoms.
Yeah, if you think that the state is, like, if what you mean by liberal rights are rights against the state, then insofar as you think that eventually we'll be able to do away with the state, then to that extent you've also done away with that liberal right, for the same reason that, like, if you people ever stop being so embarrassing and get rid of the monarchy, then by the way, is addressed to both of the other people on the screen. Right?
Yeah, that applies to both of us.
They are both subjects to the British Crown, right? That's if that ever happens, right? You'll have thereby, like, abolished the constitutional limits on the monarchy because those aren't relevant anymore, right?
Yeah.
So in that same sense, right, you've abolished liberal rights against the state if you've abolished the state. Now, I should cop to the fact that in some ways in the essay I might come off as, like, a very, like, orthodox defender of Marx because, like, I'm kind of at several points I'm being like, well, actually, maybe if we're thinking about what Marx says here, and here, right, there's the aspects of Matt's critique apply less than it might seem, but I should cop to the fact that I'm not really an orthodox enough Marxist to be very confident.
It would just be annoying to introduce, like, a fourth point of view into the mix if you're slightly distinct views from Marx, and so it's easy to be orthodox in the context of Matt's view and then Matt's view of Marx.
Yeah, because I don't really, like, I'm actually pretty skeptical about the withering away of the state. I mean, Joseph Schwartz has a book called The Permanence of the Political, right? Whereas as I understand his point, I'm pretty sympathetic to it. That's like, I think that, I think it's true enough that if we got past class divisions, you wouldn't need nearly as much of a coercive apparatus as you need in a class society. But, like, ultimately, I think political conflict does arise from places besides class conflict. And, you do have to like
the extraneous conditions of the planet in which kind of our Marxist society lives in.
Yeah. And you are still going to, like, no matter how much abundance we have, there are still going to be disagreements about what to do with resources and things like that. And you do need somebody to settle those disagreements. And you do need to some sort of coercive enforcement, mechanism.
I would also like to, before we get to Matt, I'd like to thank Panmina for leaving a super chat of $5 and also being the first person I've ever seen not to write a message with a super chat. Congratulations and thank you to them.
Fair enough. Well, the
Just
money,
having such a good time. They're like, here's $5 for you.
yeah, the money speaks for itself, right? It's like the moment in Mad Men when Peggy is mad at Don and says, you never tell me thank you, and he says that's what the money is for. But yeah, look, so I am a bit skeptical about that anyway, but separate topic, right? So it seems to me that one on the sort of does Marx actually bend the stick too far in the Civil War in France, that there's a pretty I don't know. I mean, I really like this idea of sort of universal recallability of delegates. That I actually think it's it strikes me as a fairly reasonable compromise between the obvious limitations of representative democracy and the fact that nobody who's actually thought about it would like to spend their lives under socialism going to meetings all the time, right? Or maybe I deeply distrust anybody who does, right? I mean, during the brief period of my life when I actually had to go to faculty meetings, they weren't even that frequent, and every time one got to the 2-hour mark, I always wanted to shoot myself in the head. And so
you fell into the category of people that was like, couldn't this just been like a long form email or something?
Yeah, totally. Right. Most of what goes on there could be emails. So yeah, I'm very to the extent that we're conceiving of socialism as an endless faculty meeting, I would like to pass right on that. But so, we want, if we want more democratic accountability than we typically have in sort of standard Western representative democracy, but we don't want to just have to make all decisions by mass meeting direct democracy stuff, then this kind of okay, we'll have representatives, but we can recall them whenever we want to, for whatever reason we want to, actually does strike me as a reasonable compromise there. But then I think maybe the more interesting points are ones, fair enough, Joel, ones where there's where Marx himself does gesture at some of these considerations in the second category about division of powers, limits on state power, things like that, right? And so I just point to two, right? So one is in the in even very early Marx on the very unfortunately titled On the Jewish Question, right? Sort of sounds like a Nazi tract. It's in the first part of that, right? He's actually giving this kind of very orthodox liberal defense of freedom of religion, against Bruno Bauer, who says, oh, Jews need to give up their religious separateness if they want to be part of a sort of future secular state that we can all have together. And Marx goes, says again, gives a very like standard kind of liberal argument that no, right? That's in fact part of the whole point of a secular state is that nobody should have to do that, right? That you can conduct your private life how you want. And it's true that in the second part of that, he does sort of write in this much more utopian vein about his hope for a society in which like all of the presuppositions of that have withered away and blah blah blah, right? Like that's all true, right? But he does still say that in the first part, and as you yourself noted in the chapter, kind of reiterates that briefly in the Civil War in France, where about freedom of religion. And maybe more interestingly to me, right? This is in Capital in chapter 15, when he's talking about factory despotism, right? He says he's got this passage where he's talking about how about the contrast between the way that the bourgeoisie wants to be ruled in the political sphere and the way that it rules workers in the economic sphere, right? He says, talks about, factory Lycurguses, right? Lycurgus is the lawgiver in ancient Sparta, right? Who work in who have, who act like private legislators, governing, like who the factory codes are merely emanations of their own private will. And he says, and here there's no hint of the division of powers, so beloved by the bourgeoisie in the political sphere. Never mind that still more approved representative system, right? So it is an interesting passage to me because he does. I mean, I think you could, to a point, plausibly write this off as just Marx doing immanent critique. That he's not really telling you what he thinks should happen. He's just kind of like pointing out the internal inconsistencies in the views of sort of bourgeois Democrats. But that doesn't feel entirely persuasive to me as a reading, because it does seem like Marx thinks that workplace despotism is really bad. And that seems overwhelmingly clear in the text, right? That he thinks that what he's describing is very bad. And it does seem like he thinks that these sort of gaps between a sort of liberal democratic political system and what goes on, within the gates of the factory tell us something about why it's bad. And so I think that, as far as late Marx goes, I think this is the sort of thing that makes me feel like there may be less of a gap there than it might originally appear. And even as far as early Marx goes, I'm more I wouldn't see the formulations in the Communist Manifesto as being as necessarily proto-Leninist as the discussion in the chapter suggests, because I think that I think that when you think about sort of how centralized the administration of the economy is, that does strike me as at least somewhat of a different question from what sort of protections for political rights exist in the question. Now, I realize that's controversial, right? There are people like Hayek, for example, who has this whole argument that you can't have, centralized state ownership in the economic sphere, without therefore, sort of empowering this illiberal monstrosity of a state. But that does at least strike me as a somewhat open empirical question, right? I mean, this is that, and I think that we, considering that we've had exactly one example of a society that sort of started out as maybe an attempt at a not very authoritarian socialist experiment that turned into Stalinism, and all of the other ones kind of started out as Stalinism, right? I'd be very reluctant to conclude too much from what was going on in the hothouse conditions of the Russian Civil War to that much more general point. And I would certainly point out that, look, I mean, we could even talk about this in a social democratic way. That in the Attlee government in Britain, for example, there was a tremendous increase in centralization of certain aspects of the economy, right? Coal mines, hospitals, and it doesn't strike me that British democracy suffered as a result of that centralization, right? So I would be a little, whatever we think about, logistically how a feasible socialism would work, which is maybe a little bit of a separate question, right? Just in principle, I would be a little bit reluctant to sort of attribute too much illiberalism even to the Communist Manifesto stuff. And I think that in late Marx, there might be evidence for a smaller gap on sort of than the chapter may perhaps suggests in terms of how much Marx is attuned to these kinds of liberal concerns about the limits of state power. And I know that was a lot, but I mean those are the places.
Yeah, I interrupted 9 minutes ago because I thought Ben was about to finish.
Yeah. No, it's like the what was it, I'm trying to remember who it is. The Bradley, maybe the guy like Bertrand Russell was reacting against. I think there's the story about somebody like saw him like walking with his wife, and saying, "14thly, my dear."
That's good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to unpack there. So I think I'm going to break this up into three components. One, talking about the kind of orthodox Marxist vision of the state. Secondly, returning to the Civil War in France. And then third, just kind of wrapping things up with what I think this says about the chapter in question.
Yeah.
So as Christine Sipnowicz points out in her book, The Concept of Socialist Law, there was a very popular orthodox Marxist view that prevailed for a long time, which was that in a post-revolutionary period, as you pointed out, the state would just wither away. Why? Because fundamentally, the state was a mechanism for class oppression. With the transition to a classless society, there'd be no more need for a state. And also, there was an economic argument sometimes put forward for this, which to the earlier point was that the superabundance produced by a hyper-efficient communism would ultimately mean that questions of distributive justice, which are really, again, at the basis of a system of class oppression, would become irrelevant because everybody would have enough just to have whatever it is that they want, right? They can take from the common stockpile and it wouldn't diminish in the slightest. Most commentators now point out that these theses all seem to be extremely implausible for a lot of the reasons that you gave, right? And even Marx himself, in, again, the critique of the Gotha program, seems to have thought it was extremely implausible that you'd have this kind of withering away process take place for anything but anywhere but a long period of time in post-socialist revolution. So given that, the question becomes, what form should the state take in a socialist or a communist society? And this brings me to the essay that we were discussing, The Civil War in France. So to your kind of breakdown of this, I largely agree with what you said, right? That there's many attractive features to the Civil War in France, not least of which is the kind of Republican or even direct democratic quality to it, where, yes, you will have representatives that you vote for in the National Assembly, but they'll be immediately recallable. And in this sense, you'll be a much more politically engaged citizen than anything comparable to what we see today, precisely because you also have to keep a sharp eye on what your representatives are due, because you might want to recall them because they make a mistake. It's also important to note that in the Civil War in France, Marx was a lot less centralist than the language, at least, of the Communist Manifesto suggests, because he endorsed the idea that actually local communes should also be, if not quite so self-governing, at least be given a wide array of latitude for how they want to organize Lyon or Orleans, right? And that makes a lot of sense, given that Marx always wanted workers to be heavily involved in how they manage factories. So it makes sense that he'd also want them to be involved in how their town was run. And the relationship of subordination between the National Assembly and these more local assemblies isn't exactly clarified in the Civil War in France, but he makes it pretty clear, I think, that these local assemblies are going to have an awful lot more power than they do, than these small towns and municipalities have relative to Paris in the 18th century, the 19th century, all of which I think is good. The problem that I did have with this essay is that, again, there's this kind of monological defense of the legislature as almost the only branch of government that is useful, because Marx thinks that, at least in this essay, or at least strongly implies, that the legislature is potentially the branch that is most democratic because it can be accountable to the people, unlike the executive branch and unlike the judicial branch. And I point out in the book that he has good reasons to have this kind of love affair with legislative government, right? Because as a sharp reader of many classical bourgeois texts, he's aware of the fact, that qua Madison, very often when liberal thinkers and conservative thinkers insist on putting constraints on legislative power, it's almost always because they sometimes very overtly just say too much democracy and granting too much power to the people is invariably going to lead to the people wanting to challenge relations of production or challenge private property. We can't have that. So we need to have a court system in place to protect private property, and of course an executive branch in place to crush potential insurrections that want to challenge class power. So there were good reasons for Marx to adopt the position that he did. But I do think, qua the conversation, that nonetheless there needs to be a place for something like liberal rights in a Marxian society, for all the reasons that anyone who's read Plato would be familiar with, right? That a purely unbridled majoritarian government, even a very responsive one, like the sort described in the Civil War in France, could very potentially cause serious damage to minorities, right? And this isn't a point that we just need to take my word on. Carl Schmitt in the 1930s used to point out that democracy, by which he meant, fascist government, can be a very anti-egalitarian form of government if it's predicated on certain kinds of exclusions. Because it's very easy for you to say, what we mean when we talk about equality is equality for us, the majority, or the Volk, not necessarily equality for other people that might reside in the state that we think are unworthy of rights, let alone political agency. So we don't need to get too much into that. But this brings me to the third, the kind of rounding off the third point, which is that, to Ben's comment, I definitely don't think that in the Civil War in France, Marx basically dismisses the idea that there would be something like, say, a Charter of Rights in the kind of hyper republic that he's talking about. He just doesn't seem to talk very much about it, right? But I think given the other kinds of writings that he was putting forward during this period, whether we look at Chapter 15 of Capital or the Critique of the Goth Program, it's pretty clear that he thinks that there will be a codified liberal rights, or at least respect for certain kinds of liberal rights in this state. I just would like to bring that intimation to the fore so that it's much more clear than it would be if you just read this text and extrapolate from that, that there's no need for something like liberal rights or to offer protections for minorities from potentially tyrannical majorities. So I'm very open to Ben's suggestion that Marx is actually closer to my position than I suggested in the chapter, because, I mean, why wouldn't I accept that, right?
Yeah,
if I could go back and rewrite it, I might kind of gesture a little bit more in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for your project if he is. Yeah. So, I mean, there is something interesting in that last point, because I know that something that we both think about contemporary politics, we've talked about before, is that the kind of like strong form judicial review that exists in the United States, which is often justified in terms of defending the rights of minorities, is actually, very bad news, right? Yes. that we shouldn't have that, right? And I don't.
Yeah, I mean, just think about Citizens United, right, where Antonin Scalia and Justice Kennedy said, "We are silencing the voice of the most important actors in the contemporary economy, big corporations." Right? How can we possibly, distort the rights of big corporations? They need them so very badly.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a question here, and I'm not presenting this as a gotcha. I just think it's an open question. I certainly wouldn't pretend to have a great answer to it myself, right? Which is like, okay, so if we agree that, like, like something like the U.S. Supreme Court is too undemocratic an institution, but we also agree that that you do need some kind of protections for minority rights. I mean, this is actually at your panel at HM last Sunday. This is something that I was bringing up in the discussion, the Q&A, right? Because Marion had kind of brought up the feminist critique from Wendy Brown and other people that that sort of traditional liberal public-private distinctions can be bad because they can protect patriarchy, and I was kind of taking the other side of that, saying, well, hold on, right? If in fact, if we believe in the capacity of people to continue to have unenlightened social attitudes, even under socialism, right? Then that then isn't in fact liberal public-private, distinctions. Isn't that a useful protection of, sexual minorities, of people who have unusual family arrangements, et cetera, et cetera? So, like, if we agree that those are things worth protecting, but, this is too much, that there is an open question about what the mechanism is that you actually want to protect those, right? I mean, I'm kind of broadly sympathetic to the idea of like popular constitutionalism.
If I could just break down there, I think I'm planning on writing about this soon, but your point there about this public-private distinction, I think is extremely germane, because there is a kind of Marxism that actually emulates a kind of conservatism in seeing any kind of legal or social division as invariably a symptom of alienation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to have a private life and you want to have a public life, then really you're going to feel alienated or divided in two as a result of that. And there's probably some form of domination that's also being baked into it. So we should try to overcome this division. Now, I think that that's true in a lot of circumstances, right? I don't want to dismiss that. But to your point, I also think that I don't necessarily always want to be a public person, and I really don't think anybody does, right? Some days you just really do want to go home, light up a blunt, watch some TV, and not fucking have to bother with anybody. If anything, if people want to bother you, you usually tell them fuck off, right? This is, you
should be able to do so.
Yeah, exactly, right. Now that's a kind of a droll example, but there are numerous ones that I can think of where we can imagine that a certain right to privacy and to be left alone is, of course, something that socialists should value.
No, I mean, look, I'm with, I'm with, the Christopher Hitchens point that, the personal is political taken too literally becomes is just totalitarianism, right? Like, like in the literal sense, totalizing, right? You don't have like a sphere of individual autonomy left, right? So yeah, I think that's totally right? So yeah, I think the question of like what sort of reasonable constitutional protections look like that we actually would want, right? Like is like I mean, we could have like the easy part is we can have a charter of rights, but of course, I mean, as I don't need to tell you, I mean, you're the one with the legal studies background, right? It's like having a nice charter of rights is a very different, like the hard part is the second question, the who's going to make me question, right? That they say, okay, here are rights that we'd like to see protected. We have them on a piece of paper somewhere, right? That's nice, right? But then like, what's the mechanism for ensuring that that government bodies actually respect them, right? And what's the if we sort of agree that what we've got in the United States isn't the way that we want it to be, right? I mean, I kind of I mean, I guess I'm broadly sympathetic to the idea that it's like what we just need is like a political culture that like where these things are integral enough that we'll kind of get popular, enforcement of them, right? Which is, I think, even under capitalism and sort of liberal democracies that aren't the United States, isn't too far off in any case. Like you have lots of countries where you have courts that are sort of empowered to like give opinions about things, but then ultimately Parliament gets to decide, right? So anyway, I don't know. I know this is a psychotically broad question to raise in like our final minutes together, but what you said made me think about it, and I just did at least want to flag it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a lot about this in my class, constitutional interpretation, actually. So it's a good question because my mind has been there very recently. So the United States is unique in many ways as adopting this almost kind of hagiographic attitude towards its founders, and also this almost borderline sacral projection of qualities that just routinely basically ascribed to the Constitution. Aziz Rana, in his book, The Constitutional Bind, describes this as a kind of creedal constitutionalism, this tendency to reverence the founders, to reverence the Constitution as borderline divine documents that are handed to us from on high. And he points out two things. First off, that is a very odd attitude to take towards a Constitution that almost no other country around the globe adopts, right? And he does not mean that as a compliment defending American exceptionalism. He means this as a kind of unusual feature that leads many Americans to be insufficiently critical of the foundational document of the country. And getting around that culture is what a big part of what his book is about. But secondly, he points out that it's not even the case that Americans have always adopted this attitude, right? I mean, there are numerous amendments to the Constitution that have been adopted over the course of the country's history. Really, the Constitution was in many ways so deeply flawed that it only held the country together for about 70 years before a massive civil war broke out. Almost 1 million people died, and then they had to go through what's now increasingly called the second founding because people were like, we might have missed some important constitutional provisions that should have been baked in to the initial document. And what Rana points out is that he really wants people to realize that when you look at the actual history of constitutionalism in the United States, what you also often see is Americans being much more frustrated with the document than laudatory of it. We're kind of in an unusual moment like that right now. And I would hope that after people become increasingly dissatisfied, or as people become increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo, they might be compelled to look a little bit more at the document itself and its history and say, maybe there's a few more things that we can tinker with there. Now, in terms of the kinds of amendments, I think that we could take to try to establish a more democratic and indeed socialist constitutional culture in the United States. There are so many, right? We could do a whole episode on that, but I'll just give three that I think are important, right? One is we need to pose far stricter term limits, especially on Supreme Court justices. I mean, when the Constitution was enacted, the average life expectancy was far lower than it is today. And most people wouldn't have expected that judges would serve for longer than 20 years, for example, right? Somebody like Clarence Thomas, who is coming up on, would serve on the bench, who served on the bench for, 30, 40, 50 years, right? That's extremely unusual. And that allows people to concentrate an awful lot of power in their hands if they're sitting justices for that long. And it also means that they become increasingly unaccountable to the public will, because if you know that you're going to get a Supreme Court seat and that nobody will get you out of there anytime soon, why not just move in as radical a right direction as you possibly want to go? The second thing that I think that we could do is draw inspiration from some other countries with regards to how the Constitution can be amended. Now, the framers of the country deliberately made it extremely hard to amend the American Constitution. And I think that there are some good reasons for that, right? You don't want to make amending the Constitution the same as just passing any other piece of legislation. Otherwise, why even bother having a Constitution? However, it's very clear, to use your expression, that the framers bent the stick way too far in the opposite direction, because there are numerous changes that many Americans, and this is statistically proven, want to make to the Constitution. For instance, the Equal Rights Amendment that they haven't been able to make precisely because it is so very difficult to meaningfully amend the Constitution. So if I had a magic wand, what I would do is wave my hand and say that the amending formula would be replaced with something like what you see in, say, Ireland, where a lot of constitutional amendments are solved purely by referenda, right?
Which is, by the way, why Ireland, unlike the United States, currently has a federal level right to abortion.
I was going to say, in Florida, how they passed, well, a majority voted for abortion to be protected, but it didn't pass. Was that like an arbitrary imposition by the Republican government, or was that some basis?
No, there's a percentage threshold.
Yeah, you have to reach a percentage threshold in order to enact those changes.
But like, when was that imposed? Is that a normal thing in Florida?
I think so. I don't know. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I have to look up, Florida's constitutional culture in order to ascertain that. But anyway, like something like direct referenda, or at least partially direct referenda, that'd be a huge improvement on this extremely slow and gummed up kind of amending formula that we have right now. And then last but not least, I would obviously want Americans to enjoy an awful lot more codified rights than they have right now. So one of the things that people have pointed out is Mia and Law made this observation in a 2012 article. There's this attitude some Americans have that the Constitution, the American Constitution, is a model for other countries to follow. And what they point out empirically is actually that has not been true for a very long time now. It's becoming decreasingly true over time. Actually, post 1989, when the Americans tried really, really hard to convince East Europeans to model many of their constitutions off the American Constitution, the attitude of most East Europeans was, that old thing, like, we don't want nothing to do with that, right? And one of the main reasons they didn't want to have anything to do with the American Constitution is the Bill of Rights is only 10 rights long, right? It's extremely small next to modern constitutions that guarantee a much more robust...
A lot of them are weird and irrelevant now, like soldiers being housed and so on.
Hey, now listen, do you want the fucking King of England to be coming to your house telling you what to do and stationing soldiers in your apartment? I don't fucking think so, right? This is exactly why, to Ben's point, you and I still have a monarch.
I was stationed in civilian objects in Syria, so...
That's fair. Anyway,
right. Like there are 10. We have 10 of them, and not quarter-in soldiers makes the cut, but like food, like not starving to death, isn't mentioned.
Yeah, exactly right. And even Ruth Bader Ginsburg pointed out that if she was a buying woman and the American Constitution was on offer compared to other constitutions, she would not choose to buy it. Right? She'd buy a constitution where a lot more rights are justiciable, like what you find in the Canadian Constitution, or for that matter, the German Basic Law, which are the two constitutions, I should add, that are most emulated worldwide contemporarily, right? So those are the kind of three things.
That someone mentioned in chat that, like, in Germany, especially recently, the Basic Law is treated as kind of like Germany.
Well, I don't think anybody should adopt a creedally constitution. I don't think anybody should adopt creedal constitutionalism in their country, because law is just law, right? It's not some magical document, and it doesn't deserve that. But I will
when you
say that
start getting
I had
into
a,
magical stuff, you end up becoming a free man on the land or whatever.
Yeah,
yeah.
and like also, I mean, ideally, like even from a bourgeois democratic perspective, right? Like ideally you'd have like there's stuff that's in the German and Canadian cases that the U.S. would be better off to also adopt, but
just to give you one very clear example, a lot of people don't know this, but the American Constitution is almost unique around the globe, and again, not in the good sense, in not guaranteeing Americans the right to vote. Right? There are certain discriminatory practices that you cannot engage in to remove an entitlement to vote, but that does not mean any American anywhere has a right to vote, which people like Vivek Ramaswamy, for example, are positively giddy over. Right? By contrast, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms expressly says that you have a right to vote. And I think that, by the 21st century, something like that is probably just commonsensical, right? And it's also extremely important given the fact that, Republican politicians all across the country have signaled very, very brazenly that if they can roll back voting rights from people they don't want participating in democracy, then fuck yes, they will, right?
Yeah, I mean, Ramaswamy, I'd say infamously, but I actually think not infamously enough. Very few people seem to remember this. In his when he was running for president, took a page from Robert Heinlein and suggested that young people between 18 and 25 be disenfranchised, but that there'd be a couple of ways they could get their voting rights back. One of which was literally the Starship Troopers method, service guaranteed citizenship. Which is look, I enjoy.
It seems a bit pointless to be in the army for 2 years to then and then after 5 years you would have got it anyway.
Hey man, naked force has solved more problems in human history than talking ever has, right?
Yeah.
What would the founding fathers of Hiroshima say about what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I actually just watched that movie again a couple weeks ago. It was playing at a theater near where I live in LA, and it is so, like, if you read the source material, it really is brilliant the way that Verhoeven takes lines of earnest dialogue and kind of makes you see the horror of them, right? In the way that he's presented them. But
well, apparently not brazenly enough for people like Elon Musk. He was retweeting about that the other day, where he had the meme of Neil Patrick Harris in front of the bug being like, it's afraid, and it was the government and the DOG. Now, whatever else you think about cutting government programs, like, did he not notice that, like, Neil Patrick Harris, who's supposed to be the hero in this story,
is literally
wearing an SS uniform, right? And like, it's not very subtle.
That Elon Musk has managed to go, like, he wanted to be liked online so much that he's now a government minister in the US.
Yeah, amazing. But yeah, no, that's true. It does say something that, yes, you could literally put Neil Patrick Harris in an SS officer's uniform and still have people like Elon Musk not get the point, which does, I guess, maybe to bring us full circle on what you said at the beginning about how your interest in liberal norms is partially motivated by your work in engaging with the right, is maybe, there's something disturbing there about thinking about the emotional appeal of authoritarianism, right? I mean, I think George Orwell says somewhere, right, that the appeal of liberal capitalism is essentially, we'll give you a good time. The appeal of socialism is in a different way the same. Hitler's appeal was, I offer you war, suffering, and death, but also lots of meaning. And, a nation fell down at his feet, which is...
People are just like, hey, tell me a little bit more about this death bit, right? I'm not sold yet, but, elaborate.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, this is the, I think that the Starship Troopers thing is like this sort of invigorating and fun in a certain way that I think leads a lot of people to not want to see the critique in the movie, right? Whereas, like, meeting everybody's material needs and respecting their individual autonomy and just kind of try to have a decent
It would make
society.
a fucking boring movie.
Would make such a boring movie, but it is also very much the movie I want to live in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that film, I should say, and I almost love it in part because it is so widely misinterpreted. So it's just like an endless lolcow for me whenever people fuck around with it. But yeah, absolutely right. And look, sometimes people, particularly on the right, have criticized this idea of liberal socialism for being boring or staid, right? There was often an accusation also made against Rawls, right? That what would people have to strive for in a liberal socialist society? Now, I think there are answers you could give to that, but I would argue that before we start to try to answer that, can we maybe just talk about how fucking difficult it would be to actually build a just society in the first place, right? One of my constant refrains is, look, if you want something to struggle for and you really want a difficult uphill battle, why not actually struggle for justice against the plutocracy that governs us right now? That'll probably eat up at least a couple fucking generations for you. And then after we've achieved that and we build a well-functioning liberal socialist or democratic society where everyone's needs are met, we can talk about, hey, why don't we start going to Mercury just to, expand new horizons for human potential? Yeah, to challenge
making
ourselves.
up problems once we've solved the real ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly right. But before we start fucking creating new difficulties for ourselves, why don't we actually just try to feed the billion people right now who live in near absolute starvation conditions, right? That would seem like a pretty fucking worthy thing to aspire to do.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I can't come up with a better ending note than that. I don't know about you, Stefan, but I will just say for anybody who still wants to see me talk to Matt about the other 11 chapters of this book, he is going to be the guest on my show a week from tomorrow, I think is what we've got in the books. So
yeah, I think it's the 25th. Yeah.
Yep, sounds right. So tune into that.
Bye.
Bye. Left is best.